Hello party people, welcome to the show. My name's Irrelevant and this is Do All the Things. And today we're going to be doing some modifications to an amplifier, more specifically the Traynor YBA1 Mod1, a modern iteration of the famous Traynor Bassmaster. It's getting a master volume mod because they added a bunch of features to this new version, but they forgot that one. So if you're not familiar with the YBA1 Mod1, it's a reissue of the Traynor Bassmaster released in 2013, I think. And if you're not familiar with the Traynor Bassmaster, that is a Canadian-made clone of the famous 5F6A circuit. That's the 59 Fender Bassman and the JTM 45. Lots of Canadians know the Bassmaster. Many who play guitar have owned one, and many have modded on one. And one common mod to do to the 5F6A circuit is called a cascade mod, and that's kind of something that's built into here. Now, in order to understand this mod, let me explain to you how these amps work real quick. In all 5F6As, the Bassman, the Bassmaster, and the 45, you got 4 inputs, 2 channels. We have a tube gain stage, we have a tube gain stage. They have their gain knobs, they mix together, then they go to another tube gain stage, and then they go to a final tube gain stage. And, well, the signal from that taps off the cathode, so it's called a cathode follower. It's wired a little bit different than the rest, and that goes out to the power amp. This is what's called a 2+0 circuit. 1 gain stage, 2 gain stage, plus the cathode follower. Now what happens in the cascade mod, we have our 2 inputs, it goes to the first gain stage, it goes to its gain knob, but then it's rerouted back around through the second set of inputs so you can still get that other functionality if you want. And then we have our, well, I shouldn't have drawn that symbol, we have our second gain stage, then that goes to the third gain stage, then to our cathode follower, and we have what's known as a 1, 2, 3+0 circuit, which is essentially a JCM 800. So it was an easy way to convert, say, a JTM 45 to JCM 800. And then you could plug an overdrive into it and essentially get metal tones. Now, depending on how this mod is implemented, the gain knob that was here will get moved over here to be a master volume. However, that's not what they did in this modification. What they did was they had their first gain stage, gain, cascaded it over, then go to the third gain stage, go to the cathode follower, but they kept the gain here, giving you 2 gain knobs. And when you're in cascade mode, this guy kind of becomes useless. You set it to, one position to maybe make the gain structure flow correctly through the circuit. And instead, what they did was there's another section of the amp in the power amp section. Past the EQ, you get the phase inverter. The phase inverter splits the signal to the 2 power tubes. And what they did was they added a tandem gain right here and called it the attenuator. And it works really well for the most part. You essentially end up cranking these main gains and then, turning down the attenuator. Now, this isn't a bad function whatsoever. I like that this amp has that because it adds more flexibility to the kind of tones you can dial in. The catch is you lose certain functionality that you might want from the Cascade mod, like the ability to overdrive the front end and create clean metal distortion. Modern amps are pretty much all front end distortion. A lot of modern amps will actually run a very clean power amp section that's not supposed to distort and add power tube distortion. The Marshall JCM 800 kind of is 50-50. You could use it either way. If you put a nice overdrive in front of it, you can have some really good tones at any volume level. I know, I do it every day. But in order to do that correctly, you need a master volume, which goes just after the EQ typically. Now let me show you this amp. As mentioned, those 45s, Bassmans, Bassmasters have 4 inputs. They've eliminated that because they know quite obviously we're not going to be plugging 2 people into this amp at the same time. It only has 1 set of inputs. What they did was they coupled those together internally and routed it to both channels. So that's another common thing you'd do with the 45 and the Bassman is you would jumper the 2 channels together to use them together to get more gain out of the amp in a really quick and dirty hack. So you got your 2 channels and you basically just dial in what you want. You want bright channel to play some cleans. You want the dark channel to plug in a distortion pedal or a DPOS unit, or you crank them both up to get, you know, that saturated super lead kind of thing that they were going for. And then the attenuators at the back. Now, why they call it a Mod 1 is because they built the Cascade mod, the 800 mod, right into it. If we pull on volume 2, it runs the 2 channels in series, much in the Cascade mod that I mentioned. And then boom, this thing kind of becomes useless. Obviously, you can turn it down and it turns it down, turns it up. Once you get past 5, it just starts sounding crappy. And then here doesn't do much. If you're trying to run this mod the way it's intended, you pretty much park it at about 5 to get the correct gain structure. And then boom, that becomes your gain and your attenuator becomes your master volume. Now, unfortunately, distorting the phase inverter can make for some dirty tones. If you want those sounds, because they can be good sounds, it's a good thing. If you don't want those sounds, it's a bad thing. We need a master volume. The other problem with distorting the phase inverter is your EQ gets nerfed. Pretty much anytime you're using this amp in a high gain mode with the attenuator down, using the attenuator as a master volume, you can tweak on these knobs all the frick you want and it does little to no difference. You're creating preamp distortion after the EQ by distorting the phase inverter. When you start distorting that phase, you'll lose the effect that the EQ has. The EQ will have more subtle effects on your distortion texture and not actually effects on your EQing. So by implementing a master volume, we should get a well more responsive EQ. Apparently this amp didn't sell too well. And it sucks because it's a really good amp. I like it. I think there should be more amps like this on the market, but there are reasons why I think it didn't sell well. For one, it's got no modern amenities, no foot switching, no friggin' effects loops or anything. It's just balls basic, a straight up plug it in, speaker out, play the thing amp. But then another thing is the weird idiosyncrasies. It can do some of those vintage tones really friggin' well. My buddy who owns this amp loves it for that reason, but it has trouble kind of doing the modern stuff because of the lack of master volume and the fact that the EQ gets nerfed. There's almost no reason to have an EQ on this amp the way they're intending you to use it. So let's take a look inside this thing and take a look at the circuit. All right, and this is what we got. Now, it's all modern PCB construction, but at the same time, I can't help but have respect for what's actually in this amp because it has certain features that make it a joy to own. For example, right here are 1 ohm current sense resistors. You can hook your multimeter up to that, set it to millivolts, and you can read what the tubes are power drawing, and then hidden in here, that's your bias adjust pod. So this amp is really easy to bias for whatever tubes you want. It's got a grounded pin 1, it can run EL34, 6CA7s, various 6L6s. Unfortunately, we can't get the bigger tubes like KT88s and 6550s in there because they did kind of nerf the design by doing this situation where you have this hole that the base of the larger tubes can't fit in. So that's an opportunity lost, but it's okay. The other thing you notice about this amp is there is but 1 transistor in the whole thing, and it is hiding in here, and all it's used for is to switch the light, the standby light. That's it. Everything else is simple, simple, simple. It's mechanical. It's like a carbureted car. It's the kind of amp you can fix yourself if you have the skills to do so. You don't have to worry about any, op amps or anything failing or switching circuits or relays or anything like that. It's just all resistors and capacitors and a couple of tubes. Now you might have noticed the standby switch is missing. This amp was damaged. My buddy got a wicked good deal on it because it was shooting sparks out its tubes. Whatever glitch that went wrong with this amp blew the standby switch out. And so another thing we're going to be doing is installing a fresh standby switch into it. And which brings me to another wonderful thing about the Traynor amp is it is a Long & McQuaid house brand. Here in Canada, we all know Long & McQuaid. It's a huge chain store. Any city of a reasonable size has one, which means I could just call up my Long & McQuaid and say, hey, can you order this part? Oh, yes, we can. And if you're into right to repair, let me tell you, bud, you can just hop right online and download their service schematics. and it's full featured. It has your blog diagram explaining how the amp works, much in the way that I explained. You got a full parts list, so I was able to cross-reference and just tell along McQuaid, can you give me part number? And then wouldn't you know it, a schematic. A schematic, bud. Oh, yeah. And in that, I can give you a further explanation of how this amp works. Got your high and your low input. You have this weird trickery going here to regulate that. You have two pipes going from the input to the circuit. One is for one channel, one is for the other channel because the mixing's kind of done over here. Now, I'm not going to explain the layout of the parallel situation because we're dealing in series. Essentially, the red wire here is going to be your main input when you're in the series, and then it goes up to here, which is going to be your first gain stage, which is also the first channel and the bright channel. Then it goes through here, through the gain, and then when this switch is flicked, and causes the signal to go this way, up through this flicked switch again, into the second gain stage, out of the second gain stage, into the second volume knob, which sucks, and then into the rest of the gain, and then over here is your EQing. Now the area we're focusing on is right here. We're going to disconnect and bypass this right there. But I found in practice, in order for the amp to sound right, we need to have that pot up to about 50%. So if we just straight up connect this, it's not going to work. So we're going to replace this with a pair of resistors. I can't draw the symbols very well here. And then we have to take the connections of this pot and move them over here right off the back end of the treble. That's where master volume normally would be. To make this mod work the way we want, we're going to be disconnecting these leads here. Everything's going to be functioning through the red leads and the first channel. We're going to lose channel 2 in parallel mode. So that is one functionality we're going to miss, but we feel that it's going to open up more overall functionality. Now this switch here, when it's flicked to parallel mode and we're disconnect here, we're going to have a floating input. That's not good. So we're going to want to ground this out. That's going to be easy because over here, part of the switch already has a ground prong to it. So it's basically just a case of taking this pin 9 and jumpering it over to pin 4. So I've put thought into how to do this. I don't know that a lot of people have bothered modding on this amp, and we don't even know how well it's going to work or how good it's going to sound. So this is fresh, untamed bush we're going to be starting to whack through here to try to sort this out. I got to start by taking this pupper apart, obviously, and because of how it's made, you know, that requires taking all the knobs off. They got good old-fashioned, you know, bolt-on knobs. The nice set screw, that's classic. I suppose there's cheaper ways they could have done that, but you know, that's a nice little vintage touch. Not sure a lot of modern amps are still doing that way. And then of course you run into the situation where every single one of these potentiometers and the input jacks need to be disconnected. That's a lot of little bits of hardware you got to keep track of, bud. Once that's done, we have to release these two screws in particular, leave these two bigger ones. Fortunately for us, we have quick disconnects, so we don't have to worry about any other wires. But the PCB is actually fastened into place by two bolts, one here and one here. And on the other side is those screws that I told you not to remove. They'll just spin on you and not actually come apart if you try to remove them. Once those are removed, this should just kind of pivot and pull out. Be careful, don't force it. Ta-da! And there is the board we're gonna work on. Yeah. Now, because we're grounding out one of those channels and we're removing this, we're gonna get this party started by removing these yellow wires. And I will pull the wires out of here too, just to clean up the install. In order to implement this mod as intended, I need to remove this second volume knob and the gain pot. I'm gonna quickly color code which side's which, because, you know, once we're looking at them upside down and backwards, we could get confused. So, red is this side, bud. Now you know. Now getting these out can be tricky. We have these huge ground supports. That's actually nice in ways, but that's gonna make them tricky to get off, especially without burning ourselves. I'm gonna have to start by solder sucking on this. All right, now we got them considerably loose. Sometimes once they're loose, you can kind of just flex them out of place, give them a wiggle. I'm hoping I can kind of leverage it out. I can pinch it from the other side. I don't have the best advice on how to do this. I just have this method of, you know, getting as much solder off as possible and then heating it up, and then while it's cooling down, giving it a wiggle so that it doesn't stick when it recools. Then, you know, if you're quick and good about it, you can kind of pull it off without burning yourself too badly. I got it all off for the most part, so let's solder suck on this pot contacts. Now these contacts you want to be very careful with. The reason why is if you have heat on them too long, you can actually burn out your pot. So pro tip, set your pot all the way to one side. Now fortunately, the contact holes that they have are wide enough that it allows a lot of air movement for the sucker to really pull the solder out. And I've mostly got everything disconnected. Boom, there it is. A B250. Now, part harder, we have to get this whole switching mechanism pot off of here. Again, be careful with your timing because that switching mechanism could have plastic inside of it. Getting 6, 7, 8, 9 contacts all out at once is gonna be fun. Okay, I got all the solder mostly off. Can I give some of these a wiggle? Oh, there's a big ground lug on the back here too. This ain't going anywhere until we get that guy loose. So I'm pretty sure we got it mostly loose. So now, perhaps with a bit of trickery, heating up all these joints at once, we can start to leverage them out. This is a trial of patience, as you can imagine. And at this point, I'm gonna say if you're willing to modify on your amp, this method I'm using, if you don't have the necessary tools and skills and technique, you're gonna damage it. You might as well just order a replacement pot, cut the old one off, and then install a fresh one. We gently, basically, try to get all these hot at the same time, leverage it a bit. Now we try to get all these ones hot at the same time, leverage it a bit that way, and then go back and forth until we inevitably burn our fingers because we're starting to get the component hot. Don't push, you'll break the pads. But also be careful of how you leverage it. Kind of want a pulling motion. Don't let it push back in on the other side. Too much push force motion will rip the contact pads off the PCB. We have to keep applying fresh solder to our tip. Ultimately, I'm finding the best way to do this is to re-wet the solder joints. Then it's easier to get them hot and then you can push them through. Oh yeah, way easier. Now it would have been super awesome sauce had I remembered that technique before. It's been a while since I've had to remove a component of that nature. I'm a little rusty on a few things. Probably makes me seem ridiculous, but you know, stuff happens. So now that we're back on track, gotta start attaching wires. I have color-coded wires here that's going to simplify the operation for me. Now somewhere in here is going to be the ground connector. It's this one here, that one there, right as seen there. And one of these pins needs to get grounded out. So that's gonna be pin 9 there, I guess. So pin 4 right here needs to get grounded out. Now what is their philosophy for the pin numbers? So we know by the schematic over here that 4 connects to yellow. So we have the yellow connector here and it connects to this trace here. That makes this pin 4. So we're gonna mark that for grounding too. All right, let's get some wires on this. We'll start with black. That's a typical ground line. Now we wrap them around nice. Get some nice wraps. I'm also biasing them towards one side. This is done easier by having loops. I would just hop on eBay and straight up order a 1 meg audio taper push-pull pot with about the same dimensions to replace the stock one altogether. You get them for guitars and they'll have the loops on them. And there we have it. 4 colored wires. So without being sure exactly what length we're gonna need them, you know, we'll just give ourselves a couple inches here so that we can get the size we want after, because they're gonna wrap around underneath and go into the PCB. Got to do the same for the top here though. Now one thing we want to test here is we want to find out what the impedance is at the center position, because we have to substitute this pot. It's being removed from that circuit. Oh hi, future me here with a little bit of a correction. I'm about to explain to you how I guessed certain resistor values and maintained a voltage divider. But no, I found a better way that I didn't end up filming. Seen here is an old tome of knowledge dug out of the archives called Bobo's Modified JCM 820-204. And this basically gives you some ideas on how to improve the sound of your 800, you know, change a resistor value here, change a capacitor value there. It's basically minor details, but there is one slightly more invasive mod right about here. Between stage 2 and 3, normally the tube connects directly to here and you have a 470 by 470 voltage divider. Bobo propositions changing that to a gooseneck, where we move the tube input into the top here, connecting directly to the capacitor. We bypass and remove this guy. We change this to a 330 and then we add a 220 right here. And that is what I ultimately ended up doing, and it worked really, really well. Now, if we look at the YBA schematic, it's actually pretty easy to implement. We simply take the wiper connection, connect it directly to the top, and replace this with the 330K resistor. I can't write it very, never mind, I give up. There, that squiggle line represents a resistor. And then, of course, they already have this resistor on the input of the tube. We just have to replace R23 with the 220. So how did we do that? Well, best I could do is draw it out for you because I don't have the amp anymore. This is looking at the front of the PCB, you know, like this. Seen here, under where the potentiometer rotated would normally hook up, I kind of took a resistor right here because I have larger 1 watt resistors, so it's hard to make them fit. The ground, which I believe is here, went around to the back of the resistor, and then the front of the resistor went here, and then I just took the lead and wrapped it back around to go through the other hole. Soldered those into place, and boom, that mod is done. R23 was located just slightly over here. Again, I had oversized resistors, so in order to make it fit, we situated the resistor like this, going through the hole there, and then it cleared the pot because actually this is closer and sits more like right around here. So, but yeah, easy peasy. Nice little gooseneck between those two stages, between stage 2 and 3, which is exactly what's going on the YBA, and boom, she sounded good. I'm gonna mark the hot side on the board to match so we don't get confused when we're soldering. That's where it gets tricky because we have to shoehorn some large components on there. I have mostly all 1 watt resistors, so that should do like that, especially if we kind of work this contact down like that. Can we get 2 leads through the same hole? That'd be convenient, but it doesn't look like it. Now I gotta clear these holes or else we're not gonna be able to get stuff back in. Let's tack a bit of solder to keep this 470 from moving around. We're gonna splay this one out in this general direction. Tack that on. Now let's proper solder them on the other side. Oh yeah, fall down. Nice. Now I just have to connect these 2 guys. Take that lead, get it tucked under here, fold it around nice, and get some solder on it. And now with these 2 resistors into place, we have simulated the knob being at 50%. Now this black hole right here for the black wire, we need that hole, so let's clear it out. Turning the pot all the way down to 0 volume happens between these 2 prongs here. So we have the hot side red. You don't need that anymore. We need to mark this. We need this pin here to be a ground. We're gonna go ahead and solder the rest of the wires. We're gonna use a black wire, nicely wrapped, tack it on. I'm gonna code the output center white, tack that on now. And then the input side, we're gonna flag red. So this is all disconnected here now. This pin here gets connected to ground via the black pin we disconnected there. Now this pot is getting moved. The red wire input side is gonna come off the treble. And then the white wire output is going to go into what the treble was connected to. Now these pots are super close together on the chassis. So red input is coming off the wiper of the treble. So let's get that onto the center here. Tack her on. The black one's going to ground, which is pretty much right beside. We'll get that stripped and ready. Doesn't need a lot of strip length. And then this guy is going to go to what the treble connected to on the output side of the treble. So make it just a little touch longer and it's going to go through the board. Now let's take a look at the board here again. The treble pot sits like this. Center is the new output to the phase inverter. The other 2 wires are going to connect right onto there like normal. Guess I'll just use some yellow and blue here. I'll put the yellow on the red marked side, and then we'll get this blue on. Now these wires don't have far to go. They pretty much just have to go underneath where the pot was. So, snippy snippy. Let's get these switch hole wires ready. Now we gotta get this guy reconnected to the board. The official tricky part. Well, not that tricky. It's just, you gotta keep track of everything going on here. So, we're doing a situation where we're reconnecting the wires of the switch. So we just look at the switch, see the position. I see that the yellow wire goes here. Tack it on. Green goes here. Red goes right next to the green. Blue goes next to this yellow. Finally, this black wire goes into this last hole. So in retrospect, the hardest part of this mod is getting this switch out. Once we get it out, everything else goes nice and fast. All right, so we need ground for the pot. It's going through the existing hole that the old black wire from the input jack came from. And I confirmed on the PCB they're on the same ground bus. So now we look at the treble pot. So the output from this goes to the center pin that was the treble pot that feeds out to the phase inverter. And now the treble pot, the other two connections otherwise connect identically. So we just line the treble pot the way it was lined up before. We can just stick those wires through those holes and tack them in with their infinite dexterity. All right, we should be all wired up now. So the mod is simply, you know, rerouting out the treble, intercepting where it goes to the phase inverter, and putting it through this pot, bypassing the pot here by adding some resistors and reconnecting everything. Now it's a question of if we can all get this back into place in the chassis. Should be able to. All right, tricky. These ones are kind of in the way right now. Well, actually, if we just kind of pre-seat them in their holes, you know, it might make things simpler. All right, it's taking a little bit of finagling. Haha, she's going, she's in. Yeah, we're good. I just go through the process of putting the hardware back on. Now, how do we want to position these guys? Any old which way they fit. Everything's clearing, so I guess we're gonna be good in that department. I'll go ahead and get a washer on there and a nut, see how she sits. All right, got all the pots in place and tightened up. Next, I'm gonna go underneath and I'm gonna install these screws to make sure that lines up. Now that I know that the PCB is sitting where it's supposed to, we're gonna put on the nuts. We can go ahead and plug these guys in. That white got a little bit too much slack. And we got the input jacks. Lock washers on one side. Hammered them on there. Now we have a circumstance where the pots, they have this flat spot on them, right? So that's kind of what indexes the knobs. So if I go ahead and put that guy on there and tighten her up, she's automatically pointing where she's supposed to be. But we're not going to get that same functionality with these two knobs anymore. So we had to kind of time it so that it's not on the flat at all anymore, so that the screw has something else to bite against. So we can put the knob on like that. See, it's gonna free spin now. Aim it at 0 and then tighten it up. There. Same thing with the treble pot. Installing the rest of them will be easy peasy. Now, let's go put it back together. One problem with this amp is the timing on all the preamp tubes is different. So it's hard to tell. You're sitting there rotating them for a while. Now I'm actually gonna test it out of chassis, just in case. I need an IAC. There's lots of IAC all right here. All right, here's hoping I turn this on and nothing explodes. Standby should work now. All right, so as mentioned, we're gonna lose functionality on channel 2 because it's been replaced with a master volume. That doesn't sound promising. Oh, shit. I've done something very wrong here. Oh boy. This is all the Wild West of modding here. As you may have already noticed, I got electrocuted. That is the fun thing about pioneering an amp mod. And you must forgive me, I am pioneering this amp mod. I didn't look this up anywhere. I'm developing it right now on camera. There's a little detail I missed. Now, you see, when I put, you know, a multimeter on the speaker jack and then another one on the input jack, I got about 200 volts measured on my meter. Telltale sign that there was a bad ground. So I pulled this all apart here to try to double check my connections. The good news is everything I've done so far is correct. These wires are all in the right place. So we've been falling around so far. Don't worry, we're still okay. Here's the problem. Traynor got tricky dicky on their grounding scheme. You see this frame that the treble pot was on? That's not just an inert frame, it's part of the ground bus. The 4 holes that it goes in, you see a trace going to that hole, you see a trace going to that hole, you see a trace going to that hole, and on the other side of the board, oh boy, right off the multi-pin connector coming from the power board, it goes to that hole. There is no other traces connecting these 4 holes. This frame was a jumper connecting these 4 holes, and they all have ground points on them distributing to the rest of the circuit. So half our circuit here wasn't grounded. We need to jumper wires between all 4 of those holes. Snip, gotta make some little jumper wires, bud. So literally all 4 of these holes have to be filled. All right, we got our 4 little wires in place. Let's flip this board around. They seem to be staying there nicely. One slipped out, we'll correct it in a second. Meantime, let's take the ones that are in place and tacky them in there. All right, those ground points are all established. That was a sneaky one, man. That slipped me a joker there. That was a wild card, but now it should be good. So let's go put it back together and I'll see ya over at the amp. All right, here it is. Let's get her going. Hopefully nothing's gonna electrocute me this time, right? All right, let's do some little confirmations here just to make sure we be sure. We're gonna tap some signal off this ground. We'll turn it on here. Now we will touch back here. Oh, sure enough, 0 volts. We're good. Yeah, we're good. Now let's plug in and see if this pupper's gonna work. Attenuator bypassed right now. She's full open. Let's grab our geeter and plug her. So you gotta remember, we're missing channel 2 now. This will no longer do anything, but we still have channel 1 in parallel mode. That will give us one 2+0 circuit, and it'll also give us the ability to do cleans because it is the bright channel. And that would involve turning up this and I think that sounds better already, just clean. But now we should be able to do one of these like that. Oh, my headstock's in the way. Now we should still get attenuated functionality if we crank that all the way down. Distort that phase inverter. Okay, now let's pump that attenuator back up because really this mod, and I almost wish now, in retrospect, I reversed the connections on the switches so that we pull for the tame channel and we leave it pushed in stock for the modded. I might do that because we pull that. We're switching her to 800 mode. Indeed, that sounds about right, what we expect to hear out of an unmodded 800. So now, well, one of the real reasons why we did this is to keep it clean with overdrive. So let's indeed try adding a bit of overdrive and see what happens. I always like judging my gain by the way the harmonics are. Now, of course, we can still turn down the attenuator and get more of that, what you call it again? Phase inverter distortion? It gets dirty though. Ooh, it definitely gets dirty. Let's open that attenuator back up. It is a bright sounding amp. Oh. Let's try a guitar that's a little darker sounding. Oh, here we go, buds. This'll mutter up. Very crunchy and very fuzzy, a lot of hush, 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 hush. But that's what happens when you take a pure tube circuit, one with very little tone modeling to it, very little snubbing capacitors there, stifling the high end, and just whack a bunch of gain at it. You get a very pure sound. It lacks in the low end, but what it lacks in low end, it makes for mid-frequency cut. This is the kind of setup that now, if you stick it next to a solid bass rig, well, it's gonna knock you on your arse, because it's a wall of pure clean mid, just like the 800. So indeed, this thing's sounding very 800-like. I'm actually quite happy with the way this turned out. Maybe a little bit of fiddling with the tubes to try to find some different sounds there. You got yourself something solid. Wouldn't quite call it a Swiss Army knife because we all know that some modern amps have way more features, but you know, pretty good for what it is. You got your sweet cleans, and now with a little bit of overdrive, you get some tight metal tones out of it. Either way, regardless of the curveballs that were thrown to me, this mod is clearly a success. Do I recommend it to you? Well, that's up for philosophical debate. As you can see, I had some difficulty. Well, mostly I just forgot the correct way to remove a PCB component of that one nature. But you know what? If I had to do this again, that wouldn't be a problem. But hey, you've seen it here. A master volume mod on a YBA1 Mod1. It's a YBA1 Mod1 mod. YBA1 Mod1 master volume mod. Maybe we call it a YBA1 Mod2 or a YBA1 Mod1A1. Mod1. Okay, we're getting carried away here. Either way, if you like this, stay tuned. I got some more amp projects coming and some quite epic things planned. It's only a matter of time. Even at bedroom volume levels now.